In 2008, a young man named Julian Buchwald was driving along a dirt road through a dense forest in southern Australia when he noticed an unusual, large animal carcass lying on the side of the road. Intrigued by its strange appearance, Julian slowed down, drove past the body, and then stopped his car. Curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to get out and take a closer look. As he crouched down to examine the carcass, he suddenly heard a sound behind him. Before he could react, everything went black. Now, let's dive into today's story. In 2008, 22-year-old Julian Buchwald lived in the small rural town of Budgeree, located in southern Australia. He resided with his parents in a modest house that sat on a vast 200-acre property, much of which was covered in thick brush and forest. Despite the expansive land, Julian and his family mostly stayed close to their home, venturing deeper into the property only on occasion to visit a secluded waterfall. Just 20 minutes north of Budgeree was another small town called Churchill, where Julian's 17-year-old girlfriend, Carolyn Watson, lived with her parents. The couple, both devout Christians, had met at their local church 2 years earlier. They planned to marry the following year when Carolyn turned 18 and finished her studies. On Tuesday, March 4th, Julian and Carolyn decided to have a picnic by the waterfall on Julian's family's property. Julian drove to Churchill to pick up Carolyn, and together they returned to his family's land, where they turned onto a narrow dirt road leading into the forest toward the waterfall. As they drove, Julian noticed what appeared to be a large, unidentifiable animal carcass on the side of the road. It looked bigger than any roadkill he had seen in the area. He mentioned it to Carolyn, who only glanced back but didn't see anything and quickly lost interest. After continuing down the dirt road for a while, they arrived at a clearing where the waterfall flowed into a small pond. Julian parked the car, and the couple set up their picnic by the water, enjoying their time together. Around 2:30 p.m, they packed up, ready to head back home, as they had promised their families they would return by 3 p.m. As Julian drove back down the dirt road, he remembered the strange roadkill and decided he wanted to take a closer look. He mentioned this to Carolyn, who reluctantly agreed but reminded him of their time constraint. Julian promised to be quick and continued driving while keeping an eye out for the carcass. After driving for a few minutes without spotting it, Julian worried he had missed it. He stopped the car in the middle of the road and told Carolyn he would quickly run back on foot to find it. Annoyed, Carolyn agreed, but urged him to hurry. Julian left the car, jogging back down the road toward the waterfall. After about 30 seconds of running, the road curved to the right, putting Julian out of Carolyn's view. Still determined to find the roadkill, Julian continued jogging, knowing the road wasn't very long. Sure enough, after a short distance, he spotted the carcass again. This time, he noticed it was partially obscured by a tree branch, which explained why he hadn't seen it on the return trip. Julian crouched down and moved the branch aside to get a better look. But just as he did, everything suddenly went black. Meanwhile, Carolyn sat in the car, waiting for Julian's return. As the minutes ticked by, she grew increasingly frustrated and checked her watch, realizing it was almost 3 p.m. Annoyed that Julian was taking so long, she turned around to look out the back window, expecting to see him running back toward the car. But there was no sign of him, just the dirt road winding off into the dense forest. Concerned, Carolyn decided to get out and search for Julian herself. She stepped out of the car, looked down the road in the direction Julian had gone, and froze in terror. Standing in the middle of the road was something her mind couldn't comprehend. She was paralyzed with fear, unable to scream or move. The figure in the road began moving toward her. Around 3:30 p.m, Julian's mother, who was at home, realized her son had not yet returned from the picnic, which was unusual for him. Julian was known for being punctual. Concerned, she stepped out onto the porch, waiting for him to appear. When 30 more minutes passed without any sign of Julian, her worry intensified. She walked to the end of the driveway, which led to the main road, and looked in the direction of the dirt road that led to the waterfall, hoping to see the car returning. As she scanned the road, she noticed something strange: a plastic bottle stuck in the chain link fence that ran along the front of the property. Curious, she walked over, pulled the bottle out, and discovered a tightly rolled piece of paper inside. She unscrewed the cap, shook out the paper, and unrolled it, revealing a message. As she read it, her heart raced and she covered her mouth in shock. The note, which was covered in strange satanic symbols and barely legible due to poor grammar and spelling, vaguely communicated that Julian and Carolyn, referred to as the boy and the girl, had been kidnapped. The note warned the family not to contact the police, or else Julian and Carolyn would not be returned. There was no ransom demand, just a vague threat of harm. Despite the ominous warning, Julian's mother was terrified and immediately called the police. When officers arrived, they examined the note and quickly noticed that it was signed with the initials ONA. The symbols and the initials led the police to a chilling realization. The note was likely from the Order of Nine Angles, or ONA, a self-professed satanic cult known for its extremist views and violent practices. The ONA is a notorious group that operates primarily in Europe, with chapters in the United States, Canada, Russia, and Australia. The cult views Christians as enemies of the world and advocates for their destruction to establish a new world order called the Imperium. Even more disturbing, the ONA openly endorses human sacrifice, claiming they target lesser-thans, or those they consider undesirable in society. Given Julian and Carolyn's devout Christian beliefs, the police feared they had been targeted by the ONA for this very reason. Initially, investigators thought the note might be a cruel prank. Carolyn and Julian had only been gone for a few hours when we found a message in a bottle wedged into the fence. At first glance, this didn't seem like the work of a sinister cult intent on performing some dark ritual with the kids. But when Carolyn's parents were informed about the note and the ongoing disappearance, they revealed something unsettling. 10 days earlier, they had received a strange letter in the mail covered in mysterious symbols. The letter made vague threats and warned them not to involve the authorities. At the time, they couldn't make sense of it and saw no reason to report it, so they dismissed it. Now, with both notes looking eerily similar, it became clear that whoever was behind the abduction had been watching them for some time, planning the event carefully. This was more than a random kidnapping. It was a well-coordinated operation. That night, the police organized a large-scale search, combing Julian's family property by air and on foot. Despite their efforts, no trace of the couple was found. Days passed with no new developments, no further communication from the mysterious group, and no additional clues turning up in the form of bottles or letters. The authorities began to fear the worst. Then, something completely unexpected happened. On March 11th, a full week after the couple disappeared, a farmer driving along a remote, winding road near Alpine National Park, some 250 miles north of Budgery, spotted something strange. Emerging from the dense forest on the roadside were a young man and woman, barely clothed and looking completely disoriented. Concerned, the farmer stopped his vehicle, rolled down the window, and asked if they were all right. The two approached and introduced themselves as Carolyn and Julian, pleading for his assistance. He immediately took them to the nearest hospital. News of their discovery reached the police in Budgery quickly. Officers hurried to the hospital where Carolyn and Julian were recovering. Doctors reported that, although the couple was severely traumatized with sunburns, bug bites, cuts and bruises, they would physically recover. The police, eager to find out what had happened, spoke to them individually, collecting their statements. What they shared painted a harrowing picture of their ordeal. Julian's account began with him inspecting what he thought was a dead animal on the side of the road. As he leaned down, he suddenly felt a sharp blow to the back of his head, rendering him unconscious. When he came to, it was dark, indicating that he had been out for hours. He was in an unfamiliar forest, tied to a tree and stripped of his clothes. Panic set in, but as he looked around, he noticed a knife partially hidden beneath some leaves nearby. Miraculously, he was able to reach the knife, hurt himself free, and run away, unsure of where he was or who had brought him there. Meanwhile, Carolyn had been sitting in the car, growing increasingly worried about Julian's absence. When she got out to look for him, she was ambushed by a masked man dressed in black. He tackled her to the ground, stripped her of her clothes, tied her up, and blindfolded her. She lay helpless on the road, unable to see or move, listening in terror as her assailant ran off. Moments later, she heard a car approaching. It stopped beside her and someone opened the trunk. The man returned, lifted her, and placed her in the trunk before driving off. For hours, she endured excruciating pain as her circulation was hurt off from the tight restraints. Eventually, the car left the main road and began bumping along a rough path before stopping. The trunk opened, and the man, still masked, yanked off her blindfold. Although disoriented, Carolyn saw her attacker clearly before he dragged her into the woods. She feared the worst, that she would be killed and left in the wilderness. After what felt like an eternity, she was dropped to the ground, her assailant returning to the car to retrieve a shovel. He showed it to her ominously before rolling her onto her side. Carolyn was positioned in such a way that she could clearly see what her captor was doing. As she watched, he began digging a hole in front of her with the shovel. The realization hit her hard. He was digging her grave. Hours passed with Carolyn lying there, dreading what was to come as the hole grew deeper. Finally, when the hole seemed sufficiently deep, the man climbed out, set aside the shovel, walked over to her, picked her up, and threw her into the pit. At this point, Carolyn fully expected her life to end at any moment. She didn't know how he planned to end her life, but she felt it was imminent. Desperately, she wriggled onto her knees and began to pray, the only thing she could think to do. As she knelt there, praying fervently, she suddenly heard the sound of her assailant walking away. The hole was deep enough that she couldn't see where he was going, but she could clearly tell he was moving away from her. It felt like her prayers had been answered. Perhaps he was going to leave her alone. But even with the attacker possibly gone, her situation remained dire. She was trapped in a hole, still bound, with no clothes, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. Meanwhile, Julian, after freeing himself with the knife he had found, began running in a random direction, shouting for help. He knew that by doing so, he might alert whoever had brought him there, but he was desperate. It was freezing, he had no clothes, and he needed help immediately. He also hoped that maybe Carolyn was nearby. After a while, to his immense relief, he heard a familiar voice call back. It was Carolyn. Stumbling through the dark forest, Julian followed her voice until he finally found her, tied up and trapped in the hole, calling out for him. In that moment, there was no time to fully explain what had happened to each of them. They were both terrified that the attacker would return. Julian jumped into the hole, hurt her restraints, and then helped her out. Carolyn could barely walk because the circulation to her legs had been hurt off for several hours, but they were determined to escape. Supporting her as best he could, Julian began to lead her away from the site. As they left, they scanned the area, hoping to find something useful. Julian had mentioned finding a knife near where he had been held, so they kept their eyes open. Not far from the hole, they spotted a sleeping bag propped against a tree, with some food and water rolled up inside. It was a bizarre stroke of luck. First, the horrible misfortune of being abducted and brought there, followed by the miraculous discovery of life-saving supplies. Without hesitating, they grabbed the sleeping bag and supplies and fled. For the next 48 hours, they endured extreme conditions. During the day, the sun beat down mercilessly, leaving them severely sunburned as they trekked through exposed terrain with little shade. At night, the temperatures dropped sharply, and they huddled together in the sleeping bag, shivering and trying to ration their limited food and water. They clung to hope, telling themselves that if they kept moving, they would eventually find help. A road, a person, anything. But to their horror, after 2 days of exhausting travel through the rugged landscape, they found themselves back at the very spot they had tried to escape. There was the hole where Carolyn had been thrown. They had inadvertently walked in a large circle. Fortunately, when they returned, the attacker was nowhere to be found. He had long since gone. Remarkably, this accident may have saved their lives. Near the site, they discovered a backpack leaning against a tree. Inside, they found more food, water, some clothing, and a map of the area. Once again, they were baffled by their simultaneous misfortune and fortune, finding essential supplies right when they needed them. But there was no time to ponder. Fearing the attacker could return, they grabbed the backpack and continued their flight. For the next 5 days, using the map as best they could, they navigated the difficult terrain. They suffered under the blistering sun during the day and shivered through freezing nights. Eventually, they stumbled onto the road where the farmer found them and brought them to safety. Upon hearing their story, the police quickly organized a massive search in the area around Alpine National Park, where the farmer had picked up Julian and Carolyn. They were determined to find the man in the balaclava, suspecting he might be connected to the ONA, or if not, still a dangerous individual who needed to be apprehended. The search team combed through the area, but found no trace of the masked man or any sign of the ONA. However, they did locate the spot where Carolyn had been buried alive. There, they recovered a shovel, some rope, and duct tape. When these items were examined, the police were stunned to discover that all of them belonged to Julian. This revelation led them to suspect that either the kidnapper had somehow taken Julian's supplies to carry out the abduction, or, more likely, Julian himself was involved in the crime. Confronted with this evidence, Julian initially denied any involvement, but under intense questioning, he finally broke down and revealed the truth. On March 4th, the day Julian and Carolyn went missing, Julian had driven them to the remote area near the waterfall as planned. But the story about seeing strange road unaliving was a fabrication. There was no road unaliving, it was simply an excuse for Julian to get out of the car later. After their picnic, when they were driving back, Julian pretended to spot the imaginary road unaliving again. This time, he insisted on getting out to investigate. Carolyn, not suspecting anything, agreed, and Julian ran off under the pretense of checking it out. Instead of finding road unaliving, Julian retrieved the items he had previously hidden near a tree: his black outfit, balaclava, knife, shovel, rope, and duct tape. Disguised and armed, he returned to the car where Carolyn was waiting. Seeing her standing outside the vehicle, he charged at her, tackling her to the ground. He overpowered her and moved her into the trunk of his car, along with the supplies. For the next 6 hours, Julian drove north to Alpine National Park, where he carried out the rest of his twisted plan, showing her the shovel to terrify her into believing she was about to be buried alive. After Carolyn was unable to see what her captor was doing, being deep in the hole and bound tightly, he swiftly fled the scene. Once out of sight, he changed his clothes and hid them near a tree. Now completely without clothes, except for the weapon he carried as part of his fabricated alibi for escaping, he began to make his way back towards where he knew Carolyn was trapped. After a short wait, he started shouting for help, a ruse designed to deceive Carolyn. Hearing his voice, she responded, "Julian, I'm over here." Julian followed the sound of her voice and, upon finding her, concocted a story about how he had been tied up nearby but managed to hurt himself free with the knife he found. He pretended to be her savior, cutting her loose while warning her that the attacker might return at any moment. Together, they scrambled out of the hole, and Julian conveniently discovered a sleeping bag along with some food and water nearby, urging her to follow him as they fled into the wilderness. Throughout the entire 7 days they spent in the wilderness, Julian was fully aware of their location. The moment when they supposedly got lost and circled back to the original site where the hole was located, only to find a backpack with additional supplies, was no accident. Julian had deliberately left the backpack there, ensuring they would return to it. After leading Carolyn in circles for 5 more days through the wilderness, they finally found the road, though Julian had always known where it was. He had deliberately prolonged their time in the bush. When the police confronted Julian with these details, they asked if Carolyn had been involved in the plot. Julian insisted that she had no idea and genuinely believed they were being stalked by a dangerous attacker who could find and harm them at any moment. When pressed about his motives, Julian revealed that both he and Carolyn were deeply committed to their faith, which included abstaining from intimate activity before marriage. However, Julian confessed that he had become increasingly frustrated with waiting, as their wedding was still a year away. Desperate to consummate their relationship, he orchestrated this entire kidnapping scenario, hoping to coerce Carolyn into having intimacy with him. During their time in the park, they had minimal clothing and only one sleeping bag, which Julian had strategically placed earlier. He used the harsh conditions to try and persuade Carolyn that they needed to have intimacy to generate enough warmth to survive. Despite his manipulative efforts, Carolyn steadfastly refused, even under the guise of life and death. She held firm to her beliefs, rejecting Julian's advances every time. After 7 days of fruitlessly attempting to coerce Carolyn, Julian finally gave up. That's when he conveniently led them to the road, where they were rescued. Julian also admitted that he had written the threatening notes before the kidnapping in an attempt to frame the Order of 9 Angles, ONA, and deflect suspicion away from himself. While out on bail before his trial, Julian attempted to flee Australia. He dyed his skin and hair a darker shade and used a fake Indian passport to try to escape to India. Although he managed to deceive the Australian authorities, he was immediately detected upon arrival in India and was extradited back to Australia to stand trial. In 2009, Julian was found guilty of kidnapping and a range of other charges, receiving a sentence of 7 years and 9 months in prison. And that's the shocking and twisted tale of Julian Buchwald, a man whose extreme desperation led him down a dark and deceitful path. This story serves as a chilling reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers can come from those we trust the most. If this story left you speechless, be sure to give it a thumbs up, share it with others, and hit that subscribe button for more mind-bending true crime stories. Stay safe, stay aware, and we'll see you in the next video.